Hi, my name is Amanda Doggett, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Peter Boris Center for Addictions Research and the DeGroote Centre for Medicinal Cannabis Research. Cannabis is one of the most commonly used recreational drugs in Canada, second to alcohol. But despite how common it is, we actually know surprisingly little about it. In terms of where my research focuses more is the epidemiology. And specifically around legalization. So how did, patterns of cannabis use change over legalization? How did, from a more sociological perspective, how did people's perceptions and attitudes towards cannabis and towards cannabis safety change over legalization? You think kind of 5 years post-legalization, we would have all the answers to those questions, but we don't. So really that's the why cannabis is that there's really like a lot of things that we don't know that we should know. One of the kind of the first unanswered questions about legalization is, did it change how people use cannabis? A kind of major question being, did it increase cannabis use in the population? So we have done a couple projects where we looked at emerging adults. So emerging adults are roughly like 18 to 29-ish years old. And they're a particular important group for looking at substance use because they have the highest rates of substance use of all the age cohorts. They're also particularly vulnerable to like the harms of cannabis use because of the higher frequency use and coupled with that developmental life stage. And thirdly, they are also a particularly good group from a research perspective because they have pretty predictable trends over time in substance use. They tend to age out, we call it, of substance use as they get older. So a big question for this cohort was, if we look at this group, which is a higher risk group, did their substance use change as a result of legalization? And when we looked at just kind of a sample of longitudinal, which means we followed the same people over time, emerging adults, we didn't find that legalization prevented that aging out process. It didn't kind of make them go in the opposite direction. They still kind of declined their substance use over time. But when we did a follow-up project and we compared to an American cohort that hadn't legalized cannabis as sort of a control group type design, cannabis use in our Canadian sample was actually stunted a little bit, the aging out process. So the decline wasn't quite as steep as it was in the American sample. So it did kind of appear that legalization may have impacted things a little bit. Another project that I alluded to earlier is kind of the social perceptions of cannabis, right? So what we did is we looked 5 years retrospectively, how have people's attitudes towards cannabis changed since legalization? And what we found was that people are generally speaking more socially accepting of cannabis use, of recreational cannabis use. They find it a little bit more socially acceptable than they did 5 years ago. But at the same time, they are a little bit more skeptical of cannabis safety and kind of have a stronger evaluation of cannabis-related risks. And from a public health perspective, that's a good thing. We don't want to see, it's more acceptable and people are kind of more nonchalant about the risks. It is good that we kind of see that crisscross of, yes, it's more acceptable, but people are evaluating the risks a little bit more strongly as well. So that is a kind of positive public health finding. The last project I'll talk about is actually a joint effort between the kind of DeGroote Centre for Medicinal Cannabis Research and the Centre for Microbial Chemical Biology at McMaster University. So for that project, what we did was we looked at the products as part of legalization, specifically in Ontario. We randomly purchased 30 cannabis oil products and we tested them for comparison to how much THC and CBD they had on their labels compared to what was actually in the products. Health Canada says that, or I should say the the regulations around cannabis products state that for cannabis extract, you can have no more than plus or minus 15% variability between what's on the label and what's actually in the product. And what we found was that 40% of the products that we purchased were actually outside of those limits. None were substantially higher, like substantially greater THC or CBD than was advertised. It was mostly an issue of there was more THC on the label compared to what was in the actual products. So that was a really interesting project to take on, because you have the one side of the epidemiology of substance use behaviors, and then you have the other side of kind of the basic biology of cannabis products that are part of legalization. And everything kind of comes together to build this story of, how legalization policies affected, people's use, people's perceptions of use, and, the cannabis products that are on the market.